Hello, and welcome to Rainbow Devilcast. I'm your host, Savannah Grace. Throughout the podcast, which is an output of Duke's Center for Sexual and Gender Diversity, we'll be talking with folks doing great work in the center and around campus to further the body of knowledge and justice. Today, we're going to hear from Professor Ara Wilson. A powerhouse in the Gender, Sexuality, and Feminist Studies department, she received her Master's in Philosophy and her PhD from the City University of New York. She has conducted long-term fieldwork in Bangkok that led to the publication of her book, The Intimate Economies of Bangkok, Tomboys, Tycoons, and Avon Ladies in the Global City. I'm sitting with Ara in the csgd library, surrounded by knowledge. Maybe it's enhanced by the setting, but I sense an aura of wisdom around here, of thoughts bubbling just below the surface, though when she speaks, it's measured and sensical. She fidgets with the handle of her backpack, and leans forward with her elbows on her knees when I pause to ask a question.
I am Ara Wilson, and I am a professor in the newly named Gender, Sexuality, and Feminist Studies, which until recently was Women's Studies, with also a secondary appointment in Cultural Anthropology. And I am the Director of Graduate Studies in the GSF program, and this year I am also kind of captain spearheader for a new minor or a relaunched minor in Sexuality Studies in the GSF program. So I'm trained in anthropology and cultural anthropology, and so my work has really looked at gender and sexuality in specifically in Thailand, in Bangkok, where I've done a fair amount of work and been going for years. And Thailand's a really interesting case for sex-gender diversity. It kind of was ignored for a long time, but now it's really on the map of thinking of sex-gender diversity. And so that was really interesting. I was really interested in questions of how the global economy or globalization was affecting things, particularly for female, or maybe what we used to call female-born or something else like that type of people, but also in a range of ways, and considering ethnicity and things like that. So my anthropological work was on Thailand and Southeast Asia, but I see myself as doing more thinking about gender and sexuality internationally, transnationally, cross-culturally, and also specifically in relation to globalization and how processes of like the global market economy or sort of the rise of human rights frameworks and all sorts of things, how those are involving and affecting sexuality and gender, with particular attention to what we did call sexual minorities, or sort of a range of kind of expressions of gender and sexuality. So that's my work. So when I finished, I taught for a bunch of years at the Ohio State University. When I finished my PhD, I was actually hired in a women's studies department. So since my professional life has been based in women's studies or gender studies programs, so I have a lot of depth of experience in that. And I was hired to do transnational feminist studies. And then I came, and then I was brought to Duke actually to direct what was then the certificate in the study of sexualities. And that was one of the 6-course certificates that was there. It was housed in what was called Women's Studies, but it was really an autonomous and interdisciplinary program. And it was groovy and very cool and everything, but like the economic crisis hit, and it was a small program. Students would take the classes, but to commit to 6 courses was difficult. They often discovered it only later. They had, all that whole kind of thing. So it was difficult to run the certificate, so we sort of put that on ice for a while, and then we moved it we decided that the best way it could survive is as a minor within the GSF, the department, and actually having that sexuality studies minor and integrating it was one of the reasons for our really recent name change to gender, sexuality, and feminist studies. So it's considered a really crucial component of it. Of course, our department already covered things like LGBT issues, or particularly, lesbianism, lesbian and gay issues, as gender diversity and all those sorts of things, but this allows a kind of interdisciplinary approach to sexuality to be really legible as part of our department. Women's studies no longer really adequately describes what we teach or what our own research is, but I think a lot of us can still feel an affection for the feminism that created these projects, and it took a lot of work, and it was a really serious commitment. And there's still arguments to be made for the fact that it's still really important to carve out space to women in the academy, in research and things like that. So, but I wouldn't say that it was fraught. The bigger thing was sort of thinking about like which order and which terms. All across the country, people are changing their names. So you start to feel like they're just putting some of the similar terms in a different kind of order. But we did very much feel like sexuality was a very important part of that, and that clearly gender better reflected a great deal of what a lot of us do. I mean, actually, I would say in some ways, a lot of our faculty don't even really, the focus of their study is not even like women qua women necessarily. Like, we have people who do animals, study animals, and the question of humans' sense of division from animals and questioning that. We have people who focus on masculinity, LGBT issues and things like that. So it definitely covers it better. So what's funny is that the administration actually was really concerned that some of our students graduating might be upset if they received their diploma that said a gender, sexuality, and feminist studies major instead of a women's studies major. And we kind of had to assure them that we really didn't think that that was the case, that our sense of students was responsive. But it's interesting to think that the administration was very concerned that you all might have felt a bait and switch, like, oh no, I needed it to be women's studies. But I think it's in step with the change of the center, right, which was the, LGBT Student Services Center, or however you phrase that. And so I think that there is a broader shift from thinking about a kind of people with a fixed identity to thinking about the broader processes of how identities get distributed, or thinking about how diversity manifests and things like that, rather than just simply saying, oh, it's this type of person that we study or that we're supporting. So I think it's definitely a broader shift, and then it allows a huge amount of variation of who gets seen and who gets feels sort of a membership in those projects. I actually think that what we're doing isn't changing at all. It's simply that the change in name is more now reflective of what we've already been doing. Even though our department and our, say, major and minor really can cover a great deal, but many of us do feel like there's been a history of a field called Sexuality Studies. There's been some history where some elements of sexuality some people felt weren't covered as well in women's studies or feminist-oriented kind of gender studies. And there's interdisciplinary conversations that might include the sciences the rise of some of the transgender sort of explorations and things like that. So I think we felt that and really named identity of sexuality studies was really important. Now, if you go back in Duke's history, some of the earliest conversations about this did sort of express an interest in LGBT studies, some of that coming from a professor in theater, and this is well before I arrived, so well before 2006 and things like that. But I think, at that time, an LGBT studies program wasn't viable, and I'm actually not sure that we could provide enough range of courses, and I'm also not sure that or at least until recently, the student demand wasn't there. So it took the form of sexuality studies because there's courses in things like primate sexuality, or there's courses on sex work or prostitution. And there, might be courses on that really revolve around what we could call heterosexual sexuality and things like that go beyond it. Duke does have like a range of faculty who partly can work on or teach on some of these issues, but has very few faculty fully dedicated to what we could call LGBT studies. I don't think that that's because of necessarily repression or things like this. It's sort of just like the way our interests are sort of realized. Like I have absolutely always looked at female sexuality, or what we could call lesbian identity in Thailand, we might call Tom and D, whatever, or things like that. But I've also looked at other things as well. But we were sad to lose the certificate, and so there was definitely an interest in the minor. We had to have a discussion about, whether or not just a standard minor, what used to be women's studies and now is GSF, could do that. It has the S for sexuality, but some of us really made the case that sexuality was worthy of being identified separately, that it might appeal to sort of different student bodies, and that there is this field out there of sexuality studies that's sort of worth flagging. So again, I wouldn't say within our department that it was highly contested. We did make a case to the university to have the minor, because you have to make a pitch and go through several stages, but I think we made a very strong case for why it should be a distinct, sort of have a distinct identity in the department. We showed that we have faculty who teach all kinds of courses. We showed that it was, sort of feasible, and also that we made the case that we think that it can really add a lot of value to undergraduates, some of whom might not realize it. Like, I mean, if you're applying to pre-med and you've done all your bio and chem and whatever, but if you are also have this sexuality sort of certificate, that can sort of set you apart from all the standard high-achieving biochem if you're interested in things like sexual health, women's health, or LGBT health, and things like that. So global health, pre-med is a track that might relate to it. Public policy, absolutely. Tons of sort of concerns around policy that have to do with sexuality, as well as and things like evolutionary anthropology. And then our more typical fields definitely are the East Campus type. So we would definitely relate to AAAS and concerns with race and ethnicity, cultural anthropology, whatever you call literature, the literature undergraduate version, and also things like English. So we have strength in the humanities and what we could call the qualitative or interpretive social sciences, but we absolutely reach out beyond that. We, it's modest because students have tons of competition of what they're going to take and what kind of programs they want to fully sort of take and things like that. We'd love to start seeing as many as sort of 10 minors in the next couple of years. We have an introductory course, so we'll really promote the introductory course. We have a range of electives and things like that. We have there's flexibility in kind of what will count, and so we're exploring that. So mainly we want to really sort of make students aware of it, get students in those classes. Those classes actually are already offered, a lot of them, so they typically enroll anyway. But so we'd like to sort of think about the fact that having a 5-course minor named Sexuality Studies is actually probably not a vulnerability in many jobs at this point in time. It might have been 15 years ago or something. It depends on your field. But if anything, it probably sets you apart. And so many of the students are talking all the time about these issues. That's one of the things I find, right, is that living on campus, the age you're at, living on campus, the world we live in, things like sexual violence, sexual assault on campus, sexual identity issues, LGBT issues, transgender issues, like those are everyday conversations. And what we would like to do is to encourage students to realize that this can totally be combined with your curriculum and your courses, and is a place of really interesting and changing and evolving scholarship and intellectual conversations and research. And so I would love to see some of the undergraduates make more links between conversations I know they're already having in, the dining halls or the bars or at shooters. And I'd love them to sort of make the link with courses and with a potential course of study. And again, I'd argue that I think that for many, many career prospects, I think that it can make you stand out, and it can definitely enhance a lot of career tracks that one can imagine. I'm excited about the fact that that we are running a transgender studies series, and we have funding from the Franklin Humanities Institute, something called Humanities Futures, but Professor Rosenberg, who's in the GSF department, and I are running this really series, which is meant as a series of events but what we hope is that it can really spark student reflection, but also faculty reflection on, what are ways to integrate this sort of growing field into our courses, right? Because it's absolutely the case, like that that a lot of what we rely on are categories of male and female that do assume a cis identity, do assume that you live out the identity you were born with, maybe your gender not, so we haven't, I think, fully rethought some of the way we do the curriculum. There is now a subfield called Transgender Studies, which interesting is that the leading journal that doesn't have to do with health or medicine on transgender issues is published by Duke, comes out of Duke University Press. It's pretty theoretically, it ranges, but it's pretty theoretically fancy. So a lot of what we're doing is pitched at a level that we hope will be relevant to undergraduates. There's a course being taught in literature and cross-listed with GSF in an Intro to Trans Studies this year, and we're helping support that. And we're bringing in a series of speakers. We're working with Keenan on something that's coming up soon on incarceration. By the time this podcast is out, this will have happened. There will have been an event on incarceration of trans people and the issues that sort of emerges. Some other speakers. But in the spring of 2017, we have one sort of symposia on race and transgender issues, which is definitely something people grapple with, that intersectionality of what it matters if you're a black trans woman, or what it matters, if you're, questions of whiteness and transgenderism. And then later in the spring, we'll have a course on pedagogy, where we're bringing in some people to help guide us and think about how do we think about, I think it's not so much on the classroom issue of access and comfort, so I don't think it's as much on pronouns or making people welcome and comfortable. I think those conversations actually are happening and that they're out there. So this is a bit more on the actual content of the course and trying to think about where could you integrate attention to trans when you're talking about other sort of gender issues like incarceration or sexual violence or biology or sort of all sorts of range of things. So that, and then in fall of 2017, we're really hoping to do a dynamic conversation between people kind of in humanities or cultural anthropology and medicine and medical providers. Duke now has this clinic concerning gender identity, pediatric, oriented to young people. And so we have endocrinology dealing with hormones here at Duke. But what would it mean to have scholars who are studying really the complexity of how people identify, right? Like, people might not have the typical narrative of I felt this way from when I was 5, or people might have a version of I feel male, but that might not sound like what it means to other people. So we think that the humanities or social sciences can help, sort of inform some of how medicine is thinking about this. So we're hoping to stage that. And the ongoing effect, we hope, is maybe to think about more course offerings and things like that. So that's a cool part. Oh, and next year the theme of the GSF department, the GSF department often has a kind of theme. So we should bring in a postdoc who does work on transgender studies, and we'll hope to have more events and things like that as well next year. So that's connected with Sexuality Studies as a minor and bringing that, and it's this initiative that the department is doing to bring attention to this, which there really hasn't been a lot of at Duke yet. So, I could also add, too, that Duke was really central in developing the kind of school of thought known as queer theory. It had several faculty, particularly Eve Sedgwick, who helped really articulate, again, pretty sophisticated theorizing under the rubric of queer, but reflected this move away from just thinking about that's a lesbian, that's a gay man, that's a bisexual, and that's a transgender. Less thinking about these sort of fixed and somewhat permanent identities, and more thinking about sort of how norms are set and how people respond to those, or how the complicated nature, as Facebook says, it's complicated, the way people live out these sorts of things. So Duke has been a center in sort of been key in some of the really interesting conversations and in advancing really sophisticated ways to think about some of these issues. So we hope to help put Duke on the map in thinking about transgender scholarship as well.
As in previous episodes, I asked Ara to share some of her thoughts and practices around self-care as she continues to critically engage in this work.
I think it's a question that actually I think advocates sometimes have asked and are asking, and I think it's a really important question in the world of advocacy and things like that. I mean, there are ways that I feel like as a professor who's trying to juggle teaching service and research, and a parent of twins, and have dealt with elder care, that self-care has definitely dropped off. I do think that because our work is so based in conceptions and ideas and things like that, that there's ways that doing something physical or tangible, like I like my power tools, or I work in the garden, and that's really different from like some academic article or something, to feel like, okay, I just planted some tomatoes, which actually, got affected by every possible disease that could affect tomatoes and isn't really successful, but nonetheless it can feel good, or doing some physical repairs or crafts and things like that. around the house. And then downtime with the kids and with my family is also important. But self-care is definitely something that a lot of professors could be better at, in that way. And, I think that I sort of could be better at it. And one thing I don't really do enough of as a sort of queer person is sort of take advantage of what's out there in Durham, or sort of, participate, get to the film festival, say, or something like that. Because of so many different demands on my time, I don't do those things. And I do miss it. I'm a native New Yorker, and I really came up taking part of a really interesting general life in New York, but also a queer and diverse life in New York. And so I do think that was part of New York's challenging, but also sustaining. And I would say I don't have that as much in my boring adult life. Adult life, it's got its drawbacks. Yeah.
This episode of Rainbow Devilcast was produced and edited by Savannah Grace. Special thanks to my guest, Dr. Ara Wilson. Hugs always to Angel Colley, Sky Wilson, Nick Antonici, Mita Connor, Michael Bledgy, Melly Bonanno, Minnie Bonanno, Janelle Taylor, Quinn Baker, Wandy Che, and Ivan Robles. Our theme song is Two-Hearted River by Snake Oil Salesman. Other music for this episode was by Kamiku, Nick Jana, and Blue Dot Sessions. Get new episodes of the podcast by subscribing to the csgd YouTube channel or SoundCloud, or by liking the Center for Sexual and Gender Diversity at Duke on Facebook. You can find out more information about the center at studentaffairs.duke.edu/csgd. See you in 2 weeks. Peace and love.